Today we're diving into the world of a soldier's life during the monumental Napoleonic Wars through the pages of the Diary of a Napoleonic Foot Soldier. This is written by a real foot soldier, Jacob Walter. He is nearing the frozen hell at the river Berezina. Let's get started. It was November 25th, 1812, when we reached Borisov. Now the march went toward the Berezina River, where the indescribable horror of all possible plagues awaited us. On the way, I met one of my countrymen by the name of Brenner, who had served with the Light Horse Regiment. He came toward me completely wet and half frozen, and we greeted each other. Brenner said that the night before he and his horse had been caught and plundered, but that he had taken to flight again and had come through a river which was not frozen. Now, he said, he was near death from freezing and starvation. This good, noble soldier had run into me not far from Smolensk with a little loaf of bread weighing about 2 pounds and had asked me whether I wanted a piece of bread, saying that this was his last supply. However, because you have nothing at all, I will share it with you. He had dismounted, laid the bread on the ground, and cut it in two with his saber. Dear good friend, I had replied, you treat me like a brother. I will not forget as long as I live this good deed of yours, but will rather repay you many times if we live. He had then found a Russian horse, a huge dun, mounted it, and each of us had to work his way through, facing his own dangers. This second meeting, with both of us in the most miserable condition because no aid was available, caused a pang in my heart, which sank in me unforgettably. Both of us were again separated, and death overtook him. When we came nearer the Berezina River, there was a place where Napoleon ordered his pack horses to be unharnessed and where he ate. He watched his army pass by in the most wretched condition. What he may have felt in his heart is impossible to surmise. His outward appearance seemed indifferent and unconcerned over the wretchedness of his soldiers. Only ambition and lost honor may have made themselves felt in his heart, and although the French and Allies shouted into his ears many oaths and curses about his own guilty person, he was still able to listen to them unmoved. After his guard had already disbanded and he was almost abandoned, he collected a voluntary corps at Dubrovna, which was enrolled with many promises, and received the name of Holy Squadron. After a short time, however, this existed in name only, for the enemy reduced even them to nothing. In this region, we came to a half-burnt village away from the road, in which a cellar was found under a mansion. We sought for potatoes, and I also pressed down the broad stairway, although the cellar was already half filled with people. When I was at the bottom of the steps, the screaming began under my feet. Everyone crowded in, and none could get out. Here people were trampled to death and suffocated. Those who wanted to stoop down for something were bowled over by those standing and had to be stepped upon. In spite of the murderous shrieking and frightful groaning, the pressure from outside increased. The poor, deathly weak men who fell had to lie there until dead under the feet of their own comrades. When I reflected on the murderous shrieking, I gave up pushing into the cellar, and I thought in cold fear, how will I get out again? I pressed against the wall so that it afforded me shelter and pushed myself vigorously little by little up the steps. This was almost impossible with others treading on my long coat. In the village of Sembin, where Napoleon ate, there was a burned house, under which was a low, timber-covered cellar with a small entrance from the outside. Here again, as potatoes and the like were being hunted for, suddenly the beams fell in, and those who were inside and were not entirely burned up or suffocated were jumping about with burned clothes, screaming, whimpering, and freezing to death in terrible pain. When I had gone somewhat farther from that place, I met a man who had a sack of raw bran in which there was hardly a dust of flour. I begged him ceaselessly to sell me a little of the bran, pressing a silver ruble into his hand. So he put a few handfuls in my little cloth, although very unwillingly, whereupon I happily continued on my journey. When I and my master came closer to the Berezina, we camped on a nearby hill, and by contributing wood I obtained a place at a fire. I immediately mixed some snow with my bran, balled it together into a lump about the size of my fist, which because of its brittleness fell into 3 or 4 pieces again in the fire, and allowed it to heat red on the outside in order to obtain something like bread from the inside, and I and my master ate it all with the heartiest appetite. After a time, from about 2 till 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the Russians pressed nearer and nearer from every side, and the murdering and torturing seemed about to annihilate everyone. Although our army used a hill on which what was left of our artillery was placed and fired at the enemy as much as possible, the question was, what chance was there of rescue? That day we expected that everyone must be captured, killed, or thrown into the water. Everyone thought that his last hour had come, and everyone was expecting it. But since the ridge was held by the French artillery, only cannon and howitzer balls could snatch away a part of the men. There was no hospital for the wounded. They died also of hunger, thirst, cold, and despair, uttering complaints and curses with their last breath. Also our sick, who had been conveyed to this point in wagons and consisted almost entirely of officers, were left to themselves, and only deathly white faces and stiffened hands stretched toward us. When the cannonade had abated somewhat, I and my master set out and rode down the stream for about half an hour to where there was a village with several unburned houses. Here was also the general staff of Württemberg. In the hiding places here I sought for something to eat at night. With this purpose I lighted candles that I had found, and I did find some cabbage, kapusk, which looked green, spotted, and like rubbish. I placed it over a fire and cooked it for about half an hour. All at once cannonballs crashed into the village, and with a wild cheer the enemy sprang upon us. With all the speed we succeeded in escaping, since we mounted and rode away as fast as possible. I couldn't leave my pot of cabbage behind, to be sure, but held it firmly in my arms on the horse, and the fear that I might lose my half-cooked meal made me forget entirely the bullets which were flying by. When we were a little distance from the place, my master and I reached our hands into the pot and ate our cabbage, kapuska, in haste with our fingers. Neither could leave his hands bare because of the cold and because of our hunger, and the cold we vied with each other in grabbing swiftly into the warm pot, and the only meal for the entire day was at an end again in short time. When it became day again, we stood near the stream approximately 1,000 paces from the two bridges, which were built of wood near each other. These bridges had the structure of sloping sawhorses suspended like trestles on shallow sunk piles. On these lay long stringers, and across them only bridge ties which were not fastened down. However, one could not see the bridges because of the crowd of people, horses, and wagons. Everyone crowded together into a solid mass, and nowhere could one see a way out or a means of rescue. From morning till night we stood unprotected from cannonballs and grenades, which the Russians hurled at us from two sides. At each blow from 3 to 5 men were struck to the ground, and yet no one was able to move a step to get out of the path of the cannonballs. Only by the filling up of the space where a cannonball made room could one make a little progress forward. All the powder wagons also stood in the crowd. Many of these were ignited by the grenades, killing hundreds of people and horses standing about them. I had a horse to ride and one to lead. The horse I led I was soon forced to let go, and I had to kneel on the one which I rode in order not to have my feet crushed off, for everything was so closely packed that in a quarter of an hour one could move only 4 or 5 steps forward. To be on foot was to lose all hope of rescue. Indeed, whoever did not have a good horse could not help falling over the horses and people lying about in masses. Everyone was screaming under the feet of the horses, and everywhere was the cry, "Shoot me or stab me to death." The fallen horses struck their feet, many of those still standing. It was only by a miracle that anyone was saved. In the crowd, the major and I held fast to one another, and as far as it was possible, I frequently caused my horse to rear up, whereby he came down again about 1 step further forward. I marveled at the intelligence with which this animal sought to save us. Then evening came, and despair steadily increased. Thousands swam into the river with horses, but no one ever came out again. Thousands of others who were near the water were pushed in, and the stream was like a sheep dip where the heads of men and horses bobbed up and down and disappeared. Finally, toward 4 o'clock in the evening, when it was almost dark, I came to the bridge. Here I saw only one bridge, the second having been shot away. Now it is with horror, but at that time it was with a dull, indifferent feeling that I looked at the masses of horses and people which lay dead, piled high upon the bridge. Only straight ahead and in the middle must be the resolution. Here in the water is your grave. Beyond the bridge is the continuation of a wretched life. The decision will be made on the bridge. Now I kept myself constantly in the middle. The Major and I could aid one another, and so amid 100 blows of sabers we came to the bridge, where not a plank was visible because of the dead men and horses, and although on reaching the bridge the people fell in masses 30 paces to the right and to the left, we came through to the firm land. The fact that the bridge was covered with horses and men was not due to shooting and falling alone, but also to the bridge ties, which were not fastened on this structure. The horses stepped through between them with their feet, and so could not help falling, until no plank was left movable on account of the weight of the bodies. For where such a timber still could move, it was torn out of place by the falling horses, and a sort of trap was prepared for the following horse. Indeed, one must say that the weight of the dead bodies was the salvation of those riding across, for without their load, the cannon would have caused the destruction of the bridge too soon. By the time I was safe, it had grown dark, and I did not know where the highway was. I lay down somewhat to the left of the road in a little clump of bushes and tied the horses to my foot. The Major sent a pole after water with a kettle bought the day before, and also gave him a piece of money, but the man and the kettle were never seen again, and we both had to eat the snow for our thirst. There were now so few people around that in our quiet place it seemed as though everyone had been struck dead. The cannon fire also ceased, and the bridge had really sunk too. Horrible was the lot of the people who still were on the other side. Hunger, cold, and water brought them to their death. When in the night a little moonlight appeared, I set out upon the march again, for on account of the cramps in my feet, I could not lie still for a quarter of an hour. Again and again I turned from one side to the other, and in the end I was frozen stiff with my clothing. Only by marching did I overcome freezing. November 26, 27, and 28. We both hurried farther along the highway, and being daily without bread and shelter, I thought of my friends at home and compared my misery and approaching end with my former life of plenty. I remembered a common saying at home: a campaign is always made out to be worse than it was. With this common notion I consoled myself, thinking, it's well that you, my beloved kindred and friends, know nothing of my condition, for it would only cause you pain, and it would be of no use to me. Yes, I thank the Creator that only I and not my brother too was here. Certainly I would have lost my brother or seen him die without aid, which would have killed me as well. I could look with indifference at the people falling by the hundreds, although the impact upon the ice bashed their heads. I could look at their rising and falling again, their dull moaning and whining, and the wringing and clenching of their hands. The ice and snow sticking in their mouths was frightful. Nevertheless, I had no feeling of pity. Only my friends were in my thoughts. During this month the cold became worse daily. I had to be more and more careful of myself in order to keep from freezing. Also keeping my horse and the Major's from starving kept me busy day and night. I rode sometimes to the right and sometimes to the left, in order to find a village, and load some straw or unthreshed sheaves on my horse and sit on top of them. Sitting on the straw was absolutely necessary, for otherwise it would have been stolen or torn away by the other horses. This concludes the 9th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. What do you think of Walter's adventures? Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.